Hello, and welcome to our presentation on insurance billing options demystified. My name is Michaela Dalsing. I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm also the CEO and co-owner of Villainous Steam. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation, and we hope it gives you some clarity on insurance so you can potentially pursue counseling options that can be helpful to you. One of the primary struggles people normally deal with counseling is the insurance coverage portion of it, because as much as we would like to believe that we can spend a lot on ourselves, looking at potentially spending anywhere from $120 to $500 a month on therapy doesn't really cut our budget for a lot of people. Let me start by saying that I am not an insurance professional. So this is all from the perspective of a mental health counselor. And even then, there might be certain information that's missing or certain information that is incomplete because it is not my profession. It's not necessarily my scope of competence, but something I feel called to at least provide a little bit of education on. So that way it's one less barrier for you if you're thinking about counseling services, because insurance is complicated. It's hard to understand. And I want to make sure that people have a little bit of a chance of understanding it without, specializing in insurance and becoming an insurance agent, because that doesn't really sound like a lot of fun to me. So let's say you are looking into counseling and you find your counselor and you're like, what do I do now? Because, shopping around can be the hard part, but figuring out how you're going to pay for it is the part that stresses a lot of people out. Over the course of this, you'll hopefully learn why you should even bother with insurance reimbursement. I don't think a lot of us need that explained to us, because ideally we all want to be reimbursed by the insurance. You'll learn some of the hot terms in insurance just because, insurance is just like anything else. There's a lot of jargon to it, and the jargon is what makes people very confused. You'll learn some ways to pay for counseling. You will learn why a counselor might not take insurance. So let's say you find the perfect counselor and you're like, but they don't take insurance, or they don't take your insurance. So while I understand that this can be frustrating from your perspective, there are several reasons as to why a counselor might not take your insurance, but that doesn't mean that they can't help you with billing options to be successful, because there are various ways that counselors operate their billing in order to reduce the barriers for you while still making sure that we're making enough to pay our bills. Of course, counseling, we are all bleeding hearts, but we still got bills to pay too. So that kind of breaks into how to choose the best billing option for yourself as well. We'll talk about how you can check your insurance for in-network options. We can talk about how you'll verify your benefits. And then talk about how to file a claim form. In the off chance that your provider, your counselor, does not take your insurance, there are claim forms that you can submit for yourself that would essentially have the insurance reimburse you. And then, of course, we'll learn a little bit about budgeting for therapy, because even if your insurance is great and there's only like a $20 to $30 copay, that's still about $100 or more a month if you're going weekly. So it's nice to have that built into your financial budget so it's not something that's overwhelming or that's breaking the bank. So why would we even bother with reimbursement, insurance reimbursement? Some of you may be familiar with the process involved with finding a counselor. Some of you may be trying it for the first time and aren't really sure where to start. For those of you who are experienced with finding counselors, you know how difficult it can be to find a therapist in-network. You can call your insurance provider and ask for a list of in-network counselors, but sometimes that's limited. You can also search sites like Psychology Today, but again, sometimes that's limited and it doesn't necessarily give you what you're looking for. So what happens if you find a therapist that works well for you but is out of your network? Because this happens sometimes. We have therapists that have certain specialties, and because their specialty is well coveted, they don't necessarily have to deal with they don't necessarily have to deal with the barriers of insurance by providing out of network services. Being open to various types of reimbursement for either out of network, billed therapy, or private pay definitely allows you to access many more of your options than you previously had. All it takes is a little bit of know-how and a little bit of willingness to navigate a system that you're normally not used to navigating. So we'll help you get the most out of your insurance so you can get the most out of therapy, because that's what we're all about. We're about people being able to go through this process and have it be healing without necessarily breaking their bank too much. Let's move on to some of the insurance terms that are jargony and can be a little confusing for a lot of people. It probably took me years to feel comfortable in differentiating some of these terms, and I think the only reason I feel comfortable differentiating them is because as a mental health provider, I've had to educate people and be a resource for them to identify like what exactly they'll be responsible for when it comes to their insurance and how much they'll have to pay out of pocket. One of the things that you need to know about all of these terms is that the terms will be the same across insurances, but the way that the insurance handles the term might be different. So when we're looking at different insurance plans, they might have specific deductibles, certain percentages that they reimburse, and the allowable amounts vary widely from plan to plan. When I say allowable amount, what I'm talking about is sometimes insurance companies or a particular plan within your insurance company will have an allowable amount for a session or a service. This means that if your therapist's fee is $150 a session, but the insurance only allows for, let's say, $100 per session, the insurance company will be processing reimbursements with that $100 in mind, and you may be responsible for the difference. That being said, this is one of the reasons why mental health providers sometimes do not take insurance, because insurance most of the time will only give mental health providers maybe 50 to 60% of what their private fee would be. Mental health providers are vastly underpaid. They're, one of the lowest earning professionals in the medical field, especially a master's level professional. So it's important to know that if the counselor you're looking at is private pay only, they're private pay for a reason, and that's to respect what they need in terms of income generation, but also it's to recognize their own value and what they bring. Moving on to these terms, coinsurance. Your coinsurance is a certain percent you must pay for each benefit period after you've paid your deductible. So, your deductible is how much money you have to spend before the benefits of your said insurance plan kick in. Deductibles are based specifically in your plan. So some plans might have $1,000 deductible versus other plans have a $2,000 deductible. So let's say we'll go with that first example. If your insurance has a $1,000 deductible, you'll be expected to pay the first $1,000 towards your healthcare services. After you reach that $1,000, your insurance provider will cover the rest of the cost. The thing to know about deductibles is that they reset every calendar year. Occasionally, they'll reset with your company's fiscal year. So that date is important to know, because if you have any expensive procedures, you want to get them out of the way at the beginning of the calendar year. So then the rest of the calendar year is either your coinsurance or your copayment. You don't want to have expensive procedures done at the end of the year, because nothing is worse than doing that and then having to restart paying your deductible after having that expensive medical bill hit. Not saying that we can always control when medical emergencies happen or when expensive procedures need to happen, but ideally, if you can, it's helpful to yourself. So back to coinsurance, it's a certain amount you have to pay after your deductible is still met. Occasionally, you do have to pay a copay as well. So some insurance companies will set it up that you have a copay and a coinsurance. A lot of companies treat them as if you have one or the other, but just so you know that those both fees can hit in the same like billable service essentially. So an example of a copay is your plan might cover 80% of your medical bill. You'll still have to pay the other 20%. So that 20% is your coinsurance. If your provider is billing for you, you only have to pay that 20%. But if that provider is having you bill, like submit for reimbursement to your insurance company, then you would have to pay the full fee up front, but you'll get 80% of it reimbursed from the insurance company. An FSA account is a flexible spending account. It's often set up by your employer through an employer plan. It lets you set aside pre-tax money for common medical expenses and dependent care. FSA funds must be used by the end of the term year. Again, this could be the end of the calendar year, so December 31st, or it could be the end of your company's fiscal year. Some companies' fiscal years end in July. That's something to be aware of as you try to maximize the utilization of the benefits that are provided to you. I'm going to skip ahead a little to the health savings account. So a health savings account is an account similar to the flexible spending account. However, this is money that you put aside for future medical cost. Money put into the account is not subject to any federal income tax when deposited, and funds can build up from year to year. So it's a little bit different from that FSA in that your funds roll over. And so if you don't use it, if you don't maximize the utilization in 1 year, you'll still have those funds for the next year. HSAs normally, and I think it's actually federally regulated, that they have to be paired with certain high deductible insurance plans. So let's say your deductible is $3,000. Then there are times when there has to be a health savings account that's offered to you to counterbalance the amount of money you'd have to pay for your deductible. A health reimbursement account is an account that lets an employer set aside funds for healthcare costs. These funds go to reimburse covered costs paid for by the employees who take part. An HRA has tax benefits for both the employers and the employees. An HMO, or a health maintenance organization, offers healthcare services only with specific HMO providers. The provider needs to be contracted with that HMO plan. Under the plan, you might have to choose a primary care doctor, like the specific doctor that they are offering. They'll offer maybe a handful. And this doctor will be your main healthcare provider. The doctor will need to refer you to other HMO specialists when needed. Services from providers outside the HMO plan are hardly ever covered except for emergencies. If you have an HMO plan, this is something to be mindful of, because that means that if your mental health provider is not a part of the HMO, you may not get any services covered, even if they bill out of pocket or you request reimbursement. Let's talk about some of the different mental health options that might appear on your plan when you go to research it. When you go to research your plan and what kind of services it covers, some of the services it'll break down is inpatient services and outpatient services. Inpatient services are services received when admitted to a hospital and a room and board charge is made. Inpatient services might include a 72-hour hold if a person is experiencing suicidal or homicidal ideation. Inpatient services might also include detox facilities or different substance use facilities that you would require an overnight stay for, or multiple overnight stays. When we talk about outpatient services, this is most of what people do for counseling and therapy in general. Outpatient services are services that do not need an overnight stay in a hospital. So going to see your mental health provider once a week for an hour a week is considered an outpatient service. There are some outpatient services that are identified as intensive outpatient. If an outpatient service is identified as an intensive outpatient service, that may be an outlier on your insurance plan in terms of how much they are willing to cover, because insurances do have different coverage rates for intensive outpatients versus regular outpatients. That's another component to be mindful of as you're thinking about the different levels of care that you might need and really identifying how much your insurance would cover. Let's talk a little bit about Medicare. Medicare is an insurance option. It's a federal program for people that are 65 or older, and it pays for certain health expenses. It also can be utilized by people that are disabled and qualify for Social Security through their disability. The reason that Medicare is on this list is because it is important sometimes to know what the Medicare standards are, just because Medicare really sets the field for reimbursement. Medicare is the primary way that insurance companies base their reimbursement rates. It's also important to know that that's one of the industry standards for billing and what an insurance company will and will not cover. Breaking down the different types of providers. So I don't know if anybody's ever looked at their insurance packets, those ones that your employers distribute, and you're like, okay, this makes no sense, because they're like in-network and out-of-network providers. So an in-network provider is a healthcare provider who has contracted with your insurance. This provider has agreed to accept whatever rate your insurance is willing to reimburse them at in exchange for having a greater referral resource. The insurance tries to just contract with a certain amount of providers in the area to say that they have full coverage of said area. An in-network provider, of course, is cheaper to the insurance, which is why they encourage people to go to an in-network provider, because they have a pre-existing contract with that provider that the provider is taking a lower amount in agreement for having a greater options for referral. An out-of-network provider is a healthcare provider who has not contracted with your insurance, so they're not a part of your network's plans. Costs associated with out-of-network providers may be higher or not even covered by your plan. Sometimes if plans have enough in-network providers in the area, they will not reimburse you for an out-of-network provider. That's definitely something to clarify with your insurance when you call them, to make sure that they are willing to cover out-of-network providers if you find an out-of-network therapist that you think you'd really jive with. A couple of other terms that you might hear when looking at your insurance benefits or talking to an insurance provider is out-of-pocket cost. So these are the costs that you must pay. Out-of-pocket costs can vary by plan, and each plan has like a maximum out-of-pocket cost. So they hit a level where they will reduce how much you have to pay because of that maximum out-of-pocket cost. And then a preferred provider organization is a type of insurance plan that offers more extensive coverage for the services of healthcare providers who are a part of the network, but still offers some coverage for providers who aren't part of the network's plan. A preferred provider health a preferred A pervert. Pervert. A preferred provider organization is a type of insurance plan that offers more extensive coverage for the services of healthcare providers who are a part of the plan's network, but still offers some coverage for providers who are not a part of the plan's network. Preferred provider organization plans generally offer more flexibility than HMO plans, but premiums tend to be higher, so that's something to be mindful of. When we're talking about private pay, these are providers that have you pay the full cost of a session or whatever service they're providing to you out of pocket, and then they might provide you a super bill. A super bill is an invoice that is issued by your counselor that allows you to submit it to your insurance for reimbursement, or you can keep it for your records for tax time when you're trying to demonstrate how much you've paid for healthcare over the past year. Looking at some of the different account options to pay for mental health counseling that help not only with taxes, but also kind of set that money aside so you can't spend it anywhere else. Because let's be honest, budgeting is difficult for most people. Like, it's hard to set a budget and maintain that budget. Let's examine some of the account options for healthcare spending that could be beneficial to you, and some that you might already have some of these, or you might have one of these, I should say, and not be utilizing it because maybe you don't necessarily understand what it's there for and how it can be most helpful to you. With a flexible spending account, an FSA is often set up through an employer plan. It lets you set aside that pre-tax money for common medical costs and dependent care. So you can spend it on your kids if your kids have medical needs that you need to pay out of pocket for. FSA funds must be used by the end of the term year. Again, maximize using those funds before the term year ends. That way you're utilizing the most of your benefits. It will be sent back to the employer if you don't use it. Again, utilize your benefits to the best of your ability. That way you're getting the care that you need, and you have the resources to make sure that you're getting that. If you're questionable on what qualifies as a medical expense or an item that you can put on your FSA account, you can definitely check with your employer's human resources team, because they can provide you a list of FSA qualified costs that you can purchase directly or be reimbursed for. A health reimbursement account is an account that lets your employer set aside funds for healthcare costs. These funds go to reimburse covered services paid for by employees who take part. And HRA has tax benefits for both the employer and employees. And then finally, an HSA. Health savings accounts, or HSAs, are accounts that let you save for future medical costs. Money put in the account is not subject to federal income tax when deposited. Funds can build up and be used year to year. They're not required to be spent in a single year. HSAs must be paired with certain high deductible health insurance plans. I think you can tell based on this chart and the number of green checks compared to red X's that you can see, if there's the option to go with one of these. Normally you want to opt for an HSA. Again, it's about the ownership of the account. It's about who gets to keep that money, because essentially if you don't use it a certain year, let's say you have a really healthy year where you don't need to tap into your HSA account to pay for any of your medical expenses, it is nice to have that roll over. For instance, when I was 23, I broke my finger, and the cost for surgery, I think, was like, let's say $1,500 to $2,000 out of pocket. And I had to be put on a payment plan. So at that age, I was on a payment plan. It probably took me a year to pay it off. But then when I was 27, I had an HSA that I hadn't really touched for a couple of years. And I broke that same pinky finger, gosh darn it. And I ended up being able to pay for it all out of the HSA. So it's to me, an HSA is by far the best plan, because thinking about making those payments over the course of a year to try to pay off that broken finger versus being able to save up money over the course of a couple of years just for that rainy day that did happen again. It was a very different experience to go through, to have that coverage and to have something that covered those out-of-pocket costs when I had something come up. When you're shopping around for mental health counselors or therapists, one of the challenging things that you might come across is a counselor who, you've researched and you're like, I would totally vibe with them, except they don't take your insurance. why would a counselor not take somebody's insurance? And why might you potentially consider going private pay for a certain counselor? Insurance companies don't always accept applications, and this doesn't mean that the therapist isn't good or that they're not qualified to do work. Insurance companies only contract with a certain number of providers in a zip code. Sometimes what happens is a certain zip code is oversaturated, so they have too many providers. So when the therapist goes to apply, they can't be accepted even if they're one of the best therapists or they have a specialty that, isn't quite as oversaturated in the market, just because that insurance is already at capacity for how many providers that they're willing to contract with. Insurance companies also do not reimburse a reasonable or livable wage. For example, if every therapist is on every insurance panel and works only with clients who are paying through insurance, there are some times where they will struggle to pay their business expenses, let alone personal expenses. Like I've said earlier, therapists are one of the most underpaid, overqualified, healthcare providers. When you look at therapist reimbursement rates compared to nurse practitioners or physical therapists, people who also have their master's level in their field of practice, it's ridiculous to see how low counselors are compared to those different providers. Also, the rates that therapists are reimbursed at from insurance companies generally don't change. Therapists have to jump through quite a few hoops in order to get reimbursed at a higher rate. So when inflation happens, or there are different things that require a therapist to make more money, essentially, the insurance isn't always willing to budge because they do have a lot of referral resources for therapists, and there are enough providers in the area that they think that they can adequately cover without a provider. Therapists who have worked in network with insurance companies for over 20 years request an increase in their reimbursement every year, and they can be denied pretty regularly. So even the price of rent going up, the price of coffee going up, the price of just about everything that goes up year by year, but the reimbursement for sessions stays the same. So it's one of the reasons why a therapist might not accept your insurance, is because they want to do work that they get reimbursed at a reasonable rate. Clearly, therapists are bleeding hearts, but we do have bills to pay. And one of our ethical requirements is to ensure that we're doing what we can to prevent burnout. That means keeping our caseloads, the number of people that we see weekly, at a rate that, we're not burning out and we're not giving less than our 100% to any given client. So some therapists will accept only private pay to ensure that they can maintain the number of sessions that is healthy for them in terms of being a balanced professional and in terms of burnout prevention and being able to give everything to every client that they see. Insurance companies can also limit the number of sessions you're allowed. So a therapist can only receive payment from the insurance company if, you're within those certain number of sessions. A lot of therapists feel limited by that number because if, let's say you have a presenting issue where you might need 20 sessions, but your insurance is only willing to reimburse 12, then you already have an established relationship with that therapist, but your insurance is only giving you 12 sessions, which puts us in an ethical conundrum of how do we give you the treatment of 20 sessions in 12 sessions. This puts both of us at risk, both you and the therapist that you're working with, of cutting your work short, rushing the work altogether, and not reaching the fullest potential of your healing process. Often, healing process in therapy is unpredictable. I've had people ask me to put a certain number of sessions, like a guess number on how many sessions it would take for a certain person to get to the point of being done with services. And I mean, I can give a best guess, I can give a ballpark, but that doesn't mean that that best guess is going to be accurate, because it is just guessing based on the data that I have in my head. It's guessing on the little bit I know about the person when I'm asked to make that guess. But some people overcome obstacles in a couple sessions versus others need 25 sessions, and others need even more than that. So it's really hard to have that limitation put in order to, that limitation put on care of, you must treat this person's presenting problem within X amount of sessions, that otherwise, tough luck for that person. Another reason that therapists might not accept insurance is because in order to receive payment from insurance companies, we need to give a diagnosis. There are some people that come in and really just want to talk through life transitions. It's a different year, they're going through different things. But that doesn't mean that they meet criteria for a diagnosis of a mental health disorder. And in order to bill their insurance, we have to say that they have a diagnosis. It puts us in a difficult spot where we have to give a diagnosis, which might be, damaging to the person. They might be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was bad enough to be generalized anxiety disorder. I thought I was just a little anxious. When we put that diagnosis on you, that can be carried with you in certain situations. For example, if a court, for any reason, orders to see your treatment history, that might need to be shared, that diagnosis. If you plan on serving in the military at any point in time, the military will often ask if you have previous mental health disorders or diagnoses. So it puts mental health counselors in this weird predicament where we need to give a diagnosis in order to get the insurance reimbursement. But that might not always mean that we mean that diagnosis is 100%, that it's lifelong, but it could impact you lifelong. And that's a trying spot to be in. And sometimes people are just seeking services for general life stress and circumstances that don't otherwise fall under a formal mental illness or diagnosis. It also might feel like, it's disrespecting the general notion of your privacy, because you might not want that diagnosis on your record. Having a diagnosis on your record may prevent you from receiving other types of desired services, like life insurance, despite you being deserving of equal access. Another reason why you might consider private pay over having your insurance reimburse is sometimes your copay is still quite high. Based on the information regarding your specific healthcare plan, your out-of-network benefits may actually make seeing a therapist who is not in network with your insurance company just as affordable or even more affordable than going in network, just because of the copays. Another reason why you would benefit from considering private pay is that using your health insurance makes it harder to choose your own therapist and causes you to be limited by who accepts your insurance in network and who's available currently in their practice. I mean, we are in a mental health crisis, and so a lot of providers have wait lists right now. So sometimes when you're calling around, even if your insurance has 10 to 20 in-network therapists in your area that accept your insurance, they might not be available. They might have a wait list that could be weeks to months long. And so it may be beneficial to consider private pay or out-of-network therapists for that reason, because if you are needing these services, getting them sooner rather than later could be really helpful. Another reason why that you might want to consider private pay is if your plan has a high deductible. If your plan has a high deductible, you would be paying fully out of pocket for months before your insurance benefits kick in anyways. So if it comes down to going in network but still paying high amounts of out of pocket, For a provider that you're like, yeah, I could probably make this work because of the insurance, versus going out of network for a provider that you're like, yes, definitely feel like I vibe with them. You might be paying the same amount just because of the high deductible anyways. Another reason to consider private pay is if you plan on switching jobs in the next year or so. If you're switching jobs or your job switches insurance providers, because that happens a lot where employers will switch your insurance provider just to save a little bit of money. You may be vulnerable to needing to switch your therapist after gaining that trust, building that relationship, and reaching new levels of like strength and security. And because your employer decides to switch your insurance or you decide to switch your employers, now you have to start all over again with a new therapist. In terms of assessing what the best billing option is for you personally, some of the questions to ask yourself. One of the first questions to ask yourself is, do you know what you want to get out of therapy? Because having that question answered directs which option you might lean more towards. Because if you're wanting general support with life stress, going private pay or even, out of network providers still have to submit a diagnosis. But going private pay might be the best option for you if you're just wanting somebody to process life stress and just wanting kind of that sounding board. Couple questions to ask about to identify if you want to go with an in-network provider who directly bills your insurance. Do you have a list of your network providers? Does your insurance limit the number of sessions you can have with said provider? What happens after you reach that limited amount of sessions? Are you comfortable with the diagnosis being on file? What happens when they say you should be cured and you still feel like you need therapy? So maybe you're thinking of going to an out-of-network provider, but said out-of-network provider doesn't bill your insurance for you. They bill you, and then you submit to your insurance for reimbursement. A couple of questions to ask yourself in order to identify if that's the best route for you is, do you know what therapy model or framework works best for you? There are quite a few out there. Some of the most popular are CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, DBT, EMDR. And if that's something that you're specifically looking for, you can search for providers that specialize in that area. Another question to ask yourself is, are you comfortable with the diagnosis being on file? If you, in any way that the insurance is billed, whether it's directly billed from the provider or if you're submitting a bill from your provider to the insurance for reimbursement, that diagnosis has to be on file in order for your insurance to be willing to pay. So again, even with out of network, you have to ask yourself if you're comfortable with the diagnosis being on file. Do you trust your counselor to provide you with a super bill? And there are like conversations that you can have with your counselor up front to increase that level of trust. Do you have support in the reimbursement process? So some of the support is Reimbursify is a website that helps you submit your super bills and your claims to the insurance. So they help you kind of with that reimbursement process. Can you afford the upfront cost until reimbursement? Again, that can be a tricky one. That can be a challenging one. But some of what we can do is help you budget so you can feel that support to be able to afford the cost up front so that way you can get the treatment that is best for you. Do you have a secondary insurance through your spouse or through yourself? If so, you may be eligible for more reimbursement, but you can't double dip necessarily. That being said, even though you can't double dip, what your primary insurance doesn't cover, your secondary insurance might. So your secondary insurance won't reimburse to the level it would if it was your primary insurance, But your secondary insurance might reimburse the difference between what your primary insurance reimbursed and the amount that you still owe to your therapist. Another option is out of network, but you have the therapist bill for you because, out of network reimbursement is intimidating. So one of the questions to ask yourself is it intimidating? Do I need to ask a therapist to submit that bill for me because it's still too intimidating after some of this? Can you find a counselor that is willing to bill out of network? Some counselors that say, yes, I can be an out-of-network provider, they still won't submit the bill for you, just because it's another thing, and they really like to have the client submit the bill because it's not an insurance that they work with regularly. One thing to be mindful of is that having the counselor submit the bill for you can sometimes result in balance billing. If the claim is denied, the counselor may charge you the balance they were stuck with. So that is something to be mindful of, is that you might still be responsible for more than you originally thought you would be responsible for. Private pay. So some of the things that you might ask yourself with private pay is, do you want the freedom from insurance companies where they don't necessarily put limitations on you need a diagnosis, it needs to be a certain diagnosis, you only have a certain amount of sessions, you only can see these providers. So do you want to be free of all of that? Another question to ask yourself is, can you afford the cost without reimbursement? Because of course that is a huge consideration. Do you want the ability to see someone of your choice without limitations? There are certain providers where, to them, being self-respecting and being respecting of what they offer as a professional means that they will not contract with insurance, nor will they submit to insurance for reimbursement. So if you want to see some of those people, you may need to go private pay. And then, do you worry about feeling rushed through therapy? Because like we said, insurance can put certain limitations on therapy, and it can make it difficult for people to feel like they get everything they want or need out of their therapeutic process. A couple of things to check with your insurance for your options. Checking your summary of benefits. The summary of benefits is normally included in a member packet, like a member information packet, or on your insurance company website. So most employers will essentially hand this out at the beginning of the year or the beginning of their fiscal year to let you know of any changes that have happened and to keep you informed of what your health insurance plan covers. Sometimes they don't get the packets automatically, and it needs to be requested. Other times you can find it on the company website, so you don't necessarily need to request a packet in order to get the information you need. The summary benefits normally include this following important information. They include what your deductible is, what your out-of-pocket limit is, what your co-pays and co-insurance amounts are for different health services, and whether you have any out-of-network benefits, and if so, how costs for out-of-network providers compare to costs of in-network providers. And then again, if you can't find this information, if you can't find it via like an online website, can't find it via the paperwork that they've given you, talk to your insurance agent. You should have an insurance agent appointed to your plan and give them a call, because it's their job to help you figure out like these benefits and understand them. So don't be afraid to call them and just ask these questions outright if you're really struggling to find the information. One of the things I wanted to go over in this presentation before we wrap up is, if you've decided to go with an out-of-network provider and it's because you found their information, you thought that what they do therapeutically is what you're needing, and maybe you've met with them for a consult and you really feel that click, you really feel that connection. I want you to feel like you have the tools you need in order to be successful with that therapist and with your therapeutic outcome. Because really, a lot of therapy comes down to the therapeutic alliance. That relationship that your therapist builds with you predicts 70% of your outcome. So, how strong that relationship is, how safe you feel, how much you trust them, really it is a pivotal point in how successful your therapy will be for you. So, in the off chance that you found a provider that you're like, yes, this is the person I want to see, but they're out of network and they're willing to provide you with super bills, here's how you can submit a claim. So, the information that you need in order to submit your own claim is your insurance policy number, the group plan number, or the member number. Sometimes you need all three. Who received the services? So, was it you, and you are the primarily insured person on the plan? Or was it a secondary insured person, like your child, or maybe you're on your spouse's insurance, and so then you would not be the primary insured on that plan. You'll also need to know if there's a co-insurance or dual coverage. And then you need to know what the visit was for. So your diagnosis. So you have that information. There will be a certain claim form that you need to fill out. But what you need to do is you need to request a super bill from your therapist. It's not this huge invoice. It's just a it's a regular sized itemized invoice that's issued by your counselor, so you can submit to the insurance for the reimbursement, or you can keep your records for your private pay. You do need that super bill in order to submit for the claim. So in order to submit your claim for reimbursement, you do need that super bill because the insurance requires it for their information. Every insurance has a different form or different requirements, so make sure that you are requesting the information from your insurance. Normally, the insurance will, with a claim form, will also give you additional instructions about what other information they might need from your healthcare provider. So it's best to read through the information that they provide you before you begin, just because, of course, insurances are different, and it is best to get that information from the people that you'll be submitting directly to. And then keep your copies of the super bill until you've been reimbursed. So create a file, a folder and a file that everything can go in. And then once your reimbursement comes in, you can go in and delete that. So that way it's taken care of and you don't need to hang on to it anymore. This protects you if you need to resubmit or you need to appeal or if you need to follow up with your claim. Because again, sometimes it takes a long time for the insurance to process those claims. If for some reason your insurance doesn't cover the full amount, you might want to keep those forms because sometimes depending on how much you're paying for your healthcare throughout the year, it could be a tax deductible component for you. So it might be helpful to keep those forms just in case you're utilizing that information for tax purposes. Before sending in, it's wise to check with your insurance company the first time you submit a claim to verify everything that is needed for a successful claim is on there. If your insurance company requires anything specific, this will avoid your claim being denied and requiring a resubmission, because that process can be exhausting. Most insurance companies allow claims to be submitted online. This will not only take out the time and the cost of snail mail, but will also ensure that you have a paper trail of exactly when it was submitted, you have what you submitted to the insurance, and it helps with that double checking process of making sure that your claim is still being processed. Submitting claims online generally speeds up the process of acceptance of claims as well. So it's another benefit to submitting online. And again, you can have your agent review your claim before you submit it. If anyone will find an issue, they will. Let them work for the commission they earn off of your plan. They expect to do these kinds of tasks. That's why they have representatives there for you. Just like any other investment, therapy calls for a financial and an emotional commitment. It's easy to write off therapy as too expensive, but when we start to break down the hard cost, we'll begin to see how we'll be able to invest in ourselves. Whenever I hear people say, I can't afford to go to therapy, I normally have a little voice in my head that comes back with, well, you can't afford to not go to therapy sometimes. Mental illness and financial problems go hand in hand. I know that personally, when my mental health declines, my finances do too. I've had a history of doing some retail therapy. Not too proud of it, but I try to keep it in check now. But also, if my finances are declining, my mental health declines too. It's definitely a correlational relationship where sometimes you can't tell which came first. Did my mental health declining lead to my finances declining, or did my finances declining lead to my mental health declining? Just because when I'm struggling, I get less work done, so I make less money, of course. And on top of that, I lose motivation, so I'm more likely to give up on my financial goals, and try to spend impulsively to help cope a little bit. But also when I'm stressed about money, just because of some of the messaging that I received from my parents, it does feel like the world's falling apart when the financial picture of things is falling apart. So it is important to have therapy on your budget, because taking care of yourself really should be a non-negotiable. And it's not just because it would help you be productive and make money. Even if I didn't think going to therapy would pay off in a financial sense, it would still be worth it, because it's about your health and your well-being, and taking your health and your well-being seriously, because you can't really deny a mind-body connection just because of how your mental health changes your biological chemistry, like your hormones, your neurochemicals. All of it changes based on what's going on with your mental health. And so then we do become more prone to illness, to disease, to chronic conditions if we aren't taking care of our mental health. In terms of budgeting for counseling and for therapy, maybe consider how long you'll be in therapy. At a minimum, we suggest that you plan to be in therapy for 3 to 6 months, or at least 12 sessions. Many people will want to commit to 6 months to a year. Sometimes it feels like we don't even get into the good work, the deep work, until we're about 3 months in. But if you're somebody that wants something brief, then 3 to 6 months might be that window for you. Some people engage in therapy for many years just because they really like having that sounding board. And it could be that they only see their therapist like once a month, but they really like having that sounding board. It's a place of accountability. It helps them feel balanced. Other people can go to therapy, leave therapy, and return to therapy at various points throughout their life. So not only does it take time to get the hang of new things, but you'll also want to give yourself and your therapist time to create a strong therapeutic bond. You know yourself best. You know how long it might take to build that trust, to feel like you have a strong therapeutic relationship with your therapist. So you know about how long to budget for. Some of the things to consider when you're budgeting: do you know how much you spend on your utilities a month? Do you know how much you spend on your food, your subscriptions? If you don't know what you already spend versus what you earn, it can be really hard to determine how much more you can spend on something like therapy. It's important to budget out for the essentials and the necessities, so that way you know what your overall financial picture looks like and how much money you have at the end of the month. Once you get a better idea of what you're spending overall, you'll be able to find how much you're going to be able to spend on therapy. If you realize that you already have enough, that's great. That being said, if there isn't room in the budget right now, See what else you can do. Is there something you can cut out? Is there an amount that you can set aside every week? We know how much therapy costs, and you have an idea of the time commitment you'd like to start out with. So see where there is room in your budget for that level of investment. Taking care of your mental health is like preventative brain maintenance that can help keep issues from growing into more serious and expensive problems down the line. Research shows that alleviating psychological distress through therapy could be at least 32 times more cost effective than financial competence. That's right. Therapy will make you happier than money will. Go figure. Another thing, if you're really struggling with the budget, you can always ask your therapist if they have a sliding scale fee. You'd be surprised how open therapists are to working with people in terms of either a sliding scale or payment plan options. Just remember that if they say no, it's because they do have financial responsibilities in their life that they need to meet. A couple of options to look into if you're like, yes, I need to create a budget, but I don't really know where to start. One of the options would be Dave Ramsey's Every Dollar. It's a budgeting tool. Another one is Mint. Mint is huge. It's an app. You can put it on your phone. It can tell you where you are in relation to how much you budgeted for yourself for that month. Like, you can like add fast food into your budget. You can add gas into your budget. So that way you have something that's keeping you accountable. So if you only budgeted, a certain amount for coffee, Mint's going to tell you when you went over that certain amount for your coffee for the month. And then another one is through Personal Capital to help you budget. Again, budgeting allows you to make this crucial investment. We hope this presentation has provided you with some insights into how to navigate your insurance regarding therapy, and hopefully has empowered you to feel like you're not just limited to the in-network options that your insurance provider gives you, or feeling limited by what your insurance is willing to cover. If you found this presentation useful and helpful, please feel free to check out our website, villainesteem.com, for more useful tips on your healing journey. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram.